What happens when the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world dies, and every engineer with a PhD fails to fix it? How does a 78-year-old man in a worn leather jacket become the last hope for a billion-dollar warship? And why did a Navy captain promise to resign if the old man succeeded? Subscribe now to witness the untold stories of forgotten masters who answer the call when modern expertise fails. This is the USS Gerald R. 3 days dead in the water, and the moment Captain Evans learned that diplomas don't guarantee wisdom, but decades of listening to ships do. The aircraft carrier, USS Gerald R. sat motionless at Norfolk Naval Station, a billion-dollar giant reduced to silent steel. For 3 days, the most advanced warship ever built had refused to start. Her nuclear turbines, designed to power enough electricity for a small city, were cold and unresponsive. Captain William Evans stood on the pier, arms crossed, watching as an old pickup truck approached the security gate. His face twisted with disgust as the 1986 Ford F-150 rattled to a stop, and an elderly man climbed out, carrying a battered brown leather toolbox. Harold Miller was 78 years old, tall but stooped, with white hair under a faded Navy baseball cap, wearing jeans and a worn leather jacket that had seen better decades. He moved slowly, carefully, like a man whose knees remembered too many engine room crawls. Evans turned to his chief engineer, Commander Morgan, standing beside him with a tablet full of failed diagnostics. "This is Admiral Carter's solution? A grandfather with a toolbox?" Morgan shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, Admiral Carter specifically requested." "I know what the Admiral requested," Evans snapped. "But I've got 30 engineers with advanced degrees who've been tearing this ship apart for 3 days. And now we're supposed to believe some old-timer who probably worked on steam engines is going to fix a nuclear-powered supercarrier." Harold reached the pier, toolbox in hand, and stopped a respectful distance from Evans. His blue eyes, still sharp despite his age, took in the massive carrier behind the captain. 100,000 tons of dead weight. "Captain Evans?" Harold's voice was quiet, gravelly, with the patience of someone who'd weathered worse storms than ego. Evans looked him up and down with theatrical disdain. "Let me be clear, Mr. Miller. My engineers are the best the Navy has. MIT, Stanford, Naval Academy graduates. They've run every diagnostic, replaced every suspect component, recalibrated every system. If they can't find the problem, I seriously doubt you will." Harold said nothing, just nodded slightly. Evans stepped closer, lowering his voice to a sharp whisper, loud enough for nearby sailors to hear. "In fact, I'm so confident you'll fail that I'll make you a promise. If you, an old man with an ancient toolbox, can fix what 30 of the Navy's finest couldn't, I'll resign my commission. Right here, right now." A few sailors within earshot exchanged uncomfortable glances. Evans was crossing a line, publicly humiliating a veteran called in by an admiral. But the captain was too caught up in his own arrogance to notice or care. Harold's expression didn't change. No anger, no defense, just quiet acceptance. "May I come aboard, Captain?" Evans laughed, sharp and cruel. "By all means, Grandpa. Go right ahead, look all you want. But when you fail, and you will, I want you to admit in front of my entire crew that this was a waste of everyone's time." Harold gave a small nod and walked toward the gangway. His steps were slow but steady, the gait of a man who knew exactly where he was going and didn't need to rush to prove it. Morgan and Lieutenant Johnson, a younger engineer who'd been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, followed Harold onto the ship. Unlike Evans, they were genuinely curious. 3 days of failures had left them desperate for any fresh perspective, even from an old man in a leather jacket. As they climbed aboard, Johnson moved closer to Harold. "Mr. Miller, I know who you are. I've read about your work on the Nimitz-class propulsion systems in the '80s. It's an honor." Harold gave a faint smile. "Honor's a big word. I just fix what's broken." They descended through narrow stairways and bright corridors toward the propulsion control room. Harold touched the metal walls as he walked, fingers trailing over steel as if reading Braille, sensing temperature, vibration, something only he could feel. The control room was filled with monitors showing endless red warnings. Critical pressure, loss, turbine start failure, safety, lockout engaged. 3 exhausted engineers looked up when Harold entered. Lieutenant Davis frowned. "Who's this?" "Harold Miller," Johnson said quickly. "He's here to help." Davis sighed. "With all due respect, we've already got too many people analyzing the same data. One more is just going to get in the way." Harold didn't argue. He simply walked to the main console and studied the screens, his eyes moving faster than anyone expected from a man his age. He didn't touch anything, didn't ask questions. He just observed. After several minutes, he turned to Morgan. "I need to see the engine room." They descended 2 more levels, through corridors growing progressively hotter. The ambient noise changed as they approached the ship's heart, a steady hum from auxiliary systems. But the main turbines remained ominously silent. The engine room was vast. Massive turbines stood like sleeping giants, surrounded by complex pipe networks running in every direction. Harold paused at the entrance, taking it in, then set his toolbox down and pulled out a small flashlight. He began walking around the turbines, shining light on specific areas, crouching occasionally to examine details no one else had noticed in 3 days of frantic diagnostics. "What are you looking for?" Johnson finally asked after several minutes of silence. Harold didn't answer immediately. He continued his inspection, touching pipes, listening as if the ship itself was speaking to him in frequencies only he could hear. Then he stopped in front of a specific section of the fuel delivery system. "This ship isn't broken," Harold said quietly, almost to himself. "It's being choked." Morgan and Johnson exchanged confused looks. "Choked," Morgan repeated. "What do you mean?" Harold stood slowly, knees protesting. "It means the problem isn't where you've been looking." He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and started jotting notes. "I need the maintenance logs for the past 6 months, especially anything related to ventilation and cooling systems." "Ventilation?" Morgan frowned. "But the issue is propulsion. The sensors show critical pressure loss in—" "I know what the sensors say," Harold interrupted gently. "But sensors show symptoms, not causes." Johnson nodded. "I'll get the logs." As Johnson left, Harold approached a set of ventilation ducts running parallel to the main turbines. He knelt down slowly, supporting himself on one knee, and pressed his ear against a duct. He closed his eyes and stayed that way for several long seconds. Morgan, uncomfortable with the silence, tried conversation. "You really worked on the Nimitz-class ships?" "4 of them," Harold said, eyes still closed. "Last one was the USS Abraham Lincoln in 1989. I was younger, of course. But ships don't change as much as people think. With all due respect, Mr. Miller, the Ford is completely different. Another generation, another technology." "Technology changes," Harold said, opening his eyes and standing. "Principles don't." He looked directly at Morgan. "A ship like this doesn't stop working by accident. Something's holding it back. When you understand what a ship really is, you can hear what it's trying to tell you." Johnson returned with a tablet full of maintenance records. Harold scrolled through the data with surprising ease, his fingers steady despite his age. After several minutes, he stopped on a specific entry. Here, 3 months ago. Complete replacement of engine room ventilation filters. Johnson looked at the screen. Yeah, that was standard preventive maintenance. Harold walked to a ventilation grate near the ceiling and pointed at it. These new filters, are they from a different supplier than the originals? Morgan checked the tablet. Yes. The previous contractor had issues. We switched to another one, Navy approved. Harold nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. And nobody tested the airflow after installation. Johnson opened his mouth, then hesitated. No, we didn't think it was necessary. The filters were certified. Same specs. Specs on paper aren't the same as performance in practice, Harold said quietly. He pulled out a small digital thermometer. This ship generates enormous heat. If ventilation isn't running at full capacity, heat builds up. And when heat builds up, the sensors start sending false readings. They interpret it as pressure loss, but it's actually thermal interference. Morgan stepped forward, genuinely intrigued now. You're saying the problem is thermal? I'm saying the ship is struggling to breathe, Harold said. He began taking temperature readings at different points in the room. And when it can't breathe properly, all systems switch to safety mode. That's why the turbines won't start. It's not a failure, it's protection. Johnson felt something click in his mind. 3 days of non-stop work, dozens of engineers, millions in diagnostics, and the answer had been hidden in something as basic as ventilation. Harold recorded temperatures comparing readings, then asked Johnson to activate the ventilation system at maximum power. The hum intensified, strong airflow circulating through the room. Harold repeated his measurements. Almost 15 degrees difference in some areas, he said, showing the device to Johnson. That's enough to throw off pressure sensors. They're too sensitive to thermal shifts. Morgan rubbed his face, processing. So, if we adjust the airflow or switch back to the original filters, the ship will breathe again, Harold finished, and when it does, the turbines will come back to life. 2 hours later, the engine room was alive with activity. A team of 6 technicians worked under Harold's direction, each movement coordinated by his precise gestures and brief instructions. Johnson stayed beside him, translating when needed, watching with growing admiration. Harold had identified 5 critical points in the ventilation ducts where airflow was restricted. The new filters matched specs on paper, but had been installed in ways that created extra resistance. Seals were imperfect, causing pressure loss and hot air recirculation. Loosen this section, Harold said, pointing to ductwork. Check the joint seals. Even slight misalignment causes turbulence. The technicians worked in rhythm. Harold didn't raise his voice or assert authority. Every command was followed with quiet respect, as if everyone understood they were in the presence of someone who truly knew his craft. Morgan returned carrying an updated report, urgency and hope mixing on his face. Mr. Miller, Captain Evans wants to know how much longer. He's getting impatient. Harold didn't look up from his work. We'll finish adjustments in 30 minutes, then 15 more for preliminary testing. If everything checks out, the ship can start turbines in under an hour. Morgan hesitated. The captain also asked me to confirm that you actually know what you're doing. Harold finally looked at him. No irritation, just weary understanding. Tell the captain he's welcome to come see for himself, but I can't stop working to explain what I'm already doing. When the last bolt was tightened and final filter repositioned, Harold asked for ventilation at partial power. The fan's hum filled the room again, but this time it was different, smoother even, as if the ship was finally breathing without strain. Harold walked through his measurement points again, taking new readings. Temperature's dropping, Johnson said, almost in disbelief. 3 degrees in under 5 minutes. Harold didn't answer, but a faint smile appeared. "Now," he said, "let's test the turbines." They returned to the propulsion control room where several engineers waited tensely. Harold stepped to the main panel and asked Johnson to initiate turbine ignition protocol. Johnson's fingers trembled slightly as he entered commands. The panel lit with green lights. A low rumble began rising from deep within the ship, slow at first, then building like a giant awakening from sleep. The turbines began to spin, slowly gaining speed. "Stable pressure," Davis announced, disbelief in his voice. "Temperature within parameters, RPM increasing as expected." Morgan exhaled deeply. Johnson closed his eyes, relief flooding through him. Harold stood still, watching the screens with his usual calm. But there was something different in his eyes now. Not pride, but quiet satisfaction. "Take it up to 70%, Harold said. The turbines responded flawlessly. The sound grew into the deep roar of a carrier at full power. The floor vibrated, the air thick with the energy of reawakened machinery. Davis turned to Harold, shame and respect on his face. "I owe you an apology, sir." Harold nodded once, saying nothing. The running ship was answer enough. Morgan stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Miller, on behalf of the entire team, thank you. You saved this ship and probably our careers." Harold shook his hand. "I just helped it breathe again." At that moment, the door burst open. Captain Evans stormed in, face flushed, eyes wide. He looked at the screens, the readings, the glowing green panels, and, finally, at Harold. The silence was heavy. Everyone waited. Evans opened his mouth, but no words came. His fists clenched, veins standing out on his neck. Harold met his gaze with the same calm as always. No defiance, no superiority. Just patience. Evans finally spoke, voice low and tight. "How?" "Ventilation," Harold answered simply. "The ship was suffocating. Now it's breathing." Evans looked around, at the engineers, the monitors, back at Harold. His expression shifted. The arrogance faded, replaced by something harder to name. Humiliation, reluctant respect, and the painful realization that he'd completely underestimated the old man. Harold picked up his toolbox. "With your permission, Captain, my work here is done." And without waiting for a reply, he walked out, leaving behind absolute silence and a ship finally alive again. Harold walked through the corridors of the USS Gerald R. Ford, with the same steady cadence as when he'd arrived. The sound of turbines now echoed through metal walls, a living roar that filled every inch of the ship. To him, that sound was music, confirmation that the sleeping giant had awakened. When he stepped onto the deck, late afternoon light greeted him. The sky was painted orange and pink, the ocean breeze carrying that familiar salt scent he'd known all his life. He stopped for a moment, looking toward the horizon, taking a deep breath. "Mr. Miller, wait!" Johnson came running, breathless. Harold turned, toolbox in hand. Johnson stopped in front of him, catching his breath. "Aren't you going to stay? Watch the ship depart. Admiral Carter will be here in a few hours. He'll want to thank you personally." Harold smiled faintly. "That's not necessary. The ship's running. That was the job. But Captain Evans," Johnson hesitated. "He made a promise, said he'd resign from the Navy if you pulled this off." Harold shook his head slowly. "Promises made in arrogance are rarely kept, Johnson, and that's not what matters. What matters is that this ship will sail, that the men and women aboard will carry out their missions. The rest is just wounded pride." Johnson stood quietly, letting the words sink in. There was wisdom in this man that went far beyond machinery. "You've taught me more in a few hours than I've learned in years," Johnson said, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," Harold placed a hand on the young engineer's shoulder. "Keep listening to the ships, Johnson. They always tell you what's wrong. Most people just forget to stop and listen." They walked together toward the gangway. As they descended to the pier, Harold noticed sailors had stopped to watch him go. No cheers, no exaggerated celebration. Only silent looks of respect, the kind that don't need words. Morgan was waiting on the dock, and beside him, to Harold's surprise, stood Captain Evans. Harold stopped in front of them. Evans had his arms crossed, face still flushed, but something was different about his posture now. Something that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Miller," Evans began, voice tight as if every word cost him effort. "I underestimated you. I was wrong, and I embarrassed myself in front of my entire crew because of that promise I made." Harold didn't respond right away. He just looked at Evans with that calm, steady gaze that defined him. "Captain, you don't owe me anything," Harold said quietly. "But maybe you owe something to your engineers." Evans swallowed hard. There was no comeback for that. Only a slow, heavy nod. Harold walked toward his old F-150, parked near the base gate. He set the toolbox on the back seat and climbed in behind the wheel. The engine rumbled softly, a sound both familiar and comforting. As he pulled away, Harold looked in the rearview mirror. The USS Gerald R Ford stood tall against the orange evening sky, turbines thundering at full power, the ship breathing again, ready to return to the sea. Johnson, Morgan, and even Evans stood on the pier, watching as Harold's truck disappeared down the road. Harold drove along the coastal highway bordering the harbor. For the last time that day, he looked toward the ship. He didn't do this for recognition. Didn't do it to prove anything to arrogant captains or to collect thanks from admirals. He did it because bringing giants like that back to life, that was what kept him going. That was purpose. And in that quiet moment, driving away from a ship that would sail because of him, Harold Miller knew he had fulfilled his. The old truck rumbled down the highway, carrying a man the world would never know. But the USS Gerald R. Ford would remember. Every time her turbines roared, every time she cut through the ocean, she would carry the breath Harold Miller had given her. And that was enough. That was everything. 3 months later, Harold Miller sat in his small workshop behind his house in Virginia Beach. The space was modest, a converted garage filled with tools, engine parts, and decades of collected wisdom. A radio played classic country, softly in the background. He was rebuilding a small outboard motor for a neighbor's fishing boat when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Harold Miller," he answered, wiping grease from his hands. "Mr. Miller, this is Admiral Carter." Harold straightened slightly, surprised. "Admiral, I wanted to call personally," Carter said. "The Ford completed sea trials last week. Flawless performance. The crew sends their gratitude." "Glad to hear it, sir." There was a pause. "Mr. Miller, I also wanted you to know. Captain Evans submitted his resignation 2 weeks ago." Harold closed his eyes briefly. "That wasn't necessary." "He felt it was," Carter replied, "but I didn't accept it. Instead, I ordered him to complete a 6-month assignment at the Naval Academy teaching naval engineering ethics, specifically lessons on humility, respecting experience, and the limits of technology without wisdom." Harold said nothing, but a faint smile appeared. "I've also authorized a commendation for your service," Carter continued. "It'll be added to your record, and if you're ever willing, I'd like to establish a consulting arrangement. There are old ships that could use your expertise, and young engineers who could learn from you." "I appreciate that, Admiral," Harold said, "but I'm content where I am." Carter chuckled. "I figured you'd say that." But the offer stands. And Mr. Miller, thank you. Not just for the Ford, but for reminding us that the best tools aren't always the newest ones. After the call ended, Harold returned to the outboard motor, but his mind drifted back to that day on the pier, to the sound of turbines coming back to life, to the look on young Johnson's face when the ship finally breathed. A week later, Harold received a package. Inside was a photograph, the USS Gerald R. Ford at sea, cutting through blue water under full power. On the back, someone had written in neat handwriting, "To Harold Miller, who taught us to listen. The crew of the USS Gerald R. Ford." Harold pinned the photo to the workshop wall, next to faded pictures of other ships he'd worked on over the decades. The Nimitz, the Lincoln, the Enterprise. Giants he'd helped keep alive. He stood back, looking at them all. A lifetime of service, most of it unknown, unrecognized, but deeply felt. He didn't need parades or medals, didn't need admirals calling or captains apologizing. He just needed to know that somewhere out there, ships were sailing, turbines were running, and the next generation was learning to listen. That evening, Harold sat on his back porch watching the sun set over the water. The breeze carried salt and memory. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Ford was out there, doing what she was built to do, and Harold Miller, 78 years old, with a worn toolbox and a lifetime of knowledge, knew he'd done what he was built to do too. The workshop lights stayed on late that night. There was always another engine to fix, another problem to solve, another ship waiting to be heard. Some men retire and fade away. Others, like Harold Miller, just keep listening. Because ships don't stop talking, and the world will always need people patient enough to hear them. Harold Miller never sought fame, never chased recognition. He simply showed up, listened, and fixed what was broken. In a world obsessed with the newest technology and the fastest solutions, he was a quiet reminder of something timeless. Sometimes the most powerful tool isn't the most advanced. Sometimes it's just experience, patience, and the wisdom to listen. And that's a lesson no diploma can teach. Only decades of watching giants breathe. The old toolbox sat by the door, ready for the next call. Because there would always be a next call. And Harold Miller would always answer.